Rand gives the label objectivity, right, to this policy of maintaining the relationship between consciousness and reality, with reality setting the terms. It's not to say that consciousness doesn't have an active role to play in gathering and processing the data about reality, but that consciousness doesn't get to make up the terms, right, so to speak. It is a response or in relation phenomenon to ultimate reality. And objectivism then is in contrast to other metaphysical / epistemological schools in the history of philosophy, one of which we can call Intrinsicism, which tends to argue, get the spelling correct here, right, that reality, right, alone, right, sets the terms. I'll put the words on the board and then say a little bit about it. That consciousness, so to speak, is such a passive and derivative phenomenon that when we want to talk about the nature of reality or knowledge of reality, that we should understand consciousness as some sort of a mirror of nature, right, upon which reality writes, right, and that all that consciousness does is reflects things that nature shines upon it, or that consciousness is like a lump of plasticine upon which reality stamps its identity. And any such theory in the history of philosophy is an intrinsicist theory. So Plato, for example, would be a kind of an intrinsicist theorist. The other option is to say, and usually for more skeptical reasons, that if we want to talk about the nature of reality or the nature of knowledge, reality to a large extent drops out of the equation and consciousness, right, sets the terms. This is the position that sees consciousness as a more active processing phenomenon. But because of the nature of the active processing, this position tends to see that reality's input is diminished or becomes non-existent, and this position then typically is labeled a kind of subjectivism, right? And so this is, in one respect, a position we can call, right, the mind, right, only position, right? Either that metaphysically what we call reality is a product of our subjective consciousness, right, or that whatever we have in our consciousness, we cannot, from our personal conscious perspective, separate out what we've added from the subjective perspective from what the reality itself has added. And so the resulting phenomenon needs to be seen as a subjective kind of phenomenon. Now, Rand's point is to say that neither reality alone, right, nor subjectivism, right, alone, right, are important. Instead, the important point about knowledge, right, of reality is its objectivity, right? That reality sets the term, but consciousness is an active formulation of gathering the data, manipulating the data in various ways in order to reach kind of conclusions. And as long as that consciousness keeps its reality orientation, objectivity is possible. Of course, we can make all sorts of mistakes, right, in actively processing the data, so the concepts of truth and falsity rather become important here. But if we use our conscious apparatus properly and we learn how to do so, knowledge that is objective knowledge, right, is possible. Just to give a kind of a homey analogy here, I sometimes think of this in terms of grading as a professor. Of course, we take students' work in on a fairly regular basis, and sometimes we talk about the difference between objective grading, right, and subjective grading. And there's three positions here that are possible. Right, the intrinsicist position would be, in some sense, the idea that if I am a professor and I am reading and evaluating a student's work, that in some sense the nature and the feature of the student's work should all by itself impress itself upon my mind. So if, for example, I'm reading a paper and it really is a B+ paper, the B+ness, right, of the paper will kind of its own accord reveal itself to my mind, and I, right, as the conscious professors, merely need to register the B+ quality of the paper and then, right, acknowledge it. So that's going in a more intrinsicist direction. Or sometimes intrinsicists will talk about the values of, say, machine grading as opposed to human grading. And the idea here is that if you take the human being out of it, right, obviously a machine doesn't have consciousness, that in that sense you are getting the intrinsic value of the student's work, right, evaluated. And then a contrast concept, we're all familiar with the concept of subjective grading, right, where the grade that the professor assigns says a whole lot more about the professor and what is going on in his mind, right, as opposed to the actual qualities of the paper. So in this case, the professor, rather than reading the paper, attending to the points that it's making, noticing how the argument, say, is constructed, or how the rhetoric flows, right, or doesn't flow, instead the professor has various biases, preconceptions, right, about the students, right, or disagrees with the content of the paper, and so downgrades the paper, or perhaps, of course, overgrades the paper independently of the actual merits, right, of the paper. And that's what we would call subjective, right, grading. In fact, it's only the mind of the professor that is relevant to the grade rather than the actual reality of the paper's worth. Now, objectivity, right, to draw this analogy then would be to say that the professor, right, as a necessary part of the process here, is assigning a grade, but the professor's commitment is to evaluating the actual qualities, right, of the paper. So he or she reads the paper carefully, attends to the points that are being made, assesses the arguments, right, and so forth. And some papers actually do make points that other papers don't make. Other papers are structured in ways that are different from the way other papers are structured. And so those actual features rather of the paper, the professor is aware of those. And of course, there is an active role for the professor in identifying those points, being clear what the criteria for an A paper, a B paper, a C paper are, and then applying those criteria to the actual features, right, and so forth. So it's an active process, right, that the consciousness of the professor, right, is going to, but it's an active process directed toward the actual existing features that are really embodied in the paper. So for Rand, what she wants to do is get past this historical divide that has often plagued aspects of the history of philosophy between those who see reality itself as stamping itself on our minds and minds as being therefore passive if we're actually going to have knowledge, versus those who see the active consciousness parts necessary to the whole process and then see reality as dropping out of it. For Rand, consciousness is a relational phenomenon. Objectivity, right, and objectivism, the philosophy or the label rather that she gave to her philosophy, is in a deep way about using our consciousness to maintain our reality orientation.